Richard, the focus of much of the world's media in recent weeks has been on Libya, yet there's another war raging in Cote d'Ivoire on the African continent. How did we get here?
Well, in a nutshell, this is the story of one man's intransigence and pig-headedness, basically, in the face of the verdict of the voters of his country who voted him out of office, and the international community who have also called on him to step down. And this man's Laurent Gbagbo, Cote d'Ivoire president until November. Really, to give you a quick race through history, this crisis dates back all the way back to 2002, when a civil war ended up dividing Cote d'Ivoire into two halves, north and south. Gbagbo emerged as a sort of leader of an interim government from this process. And really, since that point, we've been waiting for credible elections to happen. They've been delayed time and time and again. And finally, in November last year, the voters finally had their chance. They voted Gbagbo out. His response was just to have himself sworn in again as president, ignored the verdict, and the person who rightfully won, Alassane Ouattara, who's from the north, had to set up an alternative administration, bunkered in a hotel in the main city of Abidjan. So that's where we're up to until recent days.
Well, what's the latest? Where are we now?
Well, events have moved pretty rapidly in the past week or so. Essentially, forces loyal to Ouattara, the rightful winner of the election, lost their patience with this drawn-out crisis and decided to resort to arms. And they swept incredibly quickly through most of the country, meeting little resistance on the way, until they reached Abidjan, the main city of Cote d'Ivoire and the main stronghold of Gbagbo as well. In recent days, you've seen some very heavy fighting there. Gbagbo's still refusing to step down until in the past few hours his presidential palace was surrounded, and only now we hear that he's negotiating perhaps the terms of his surrender. Because
the media hasn't been able to get too close to the fighting, we don't really have a clear picture of what's happening. What's been the scale of the fighting as you understand it?
By all accounts, it's been heavy fighting. Gbagbo has relied on militia fighters, essentially. Most of the formal army has deserted him. He can't pay them anymore. So these often young, ill-disciplined fighters have been charging around. There's been attacks on civilians, and heavy weaponry has been used as well. So we're still getting an emerging picture of the situation there, but it's clear that civilians have been caught up in this fighting.
What's your assessment of the U.S. and the international response? Should we be doing more?
Well, the US, along with the international community, has really spoken with one voice throughout this conflict, really saying that Gbagbo has to leave. He lost the election. There have been travel bans and economic sanctions placed on Gbagbo and the people around him, backed up by the UN Security Council. You know, the idea was that putting the slow economic squeeze on Gbagbo would eventually force him out of office. You've also got a sizable UN peacekeeping force on the ground, 11,000 people or so, backed up by French troops. They've been there for some years. And their mandate has been quite weak, but they are allowed to protect civilians and essentially stop the use of heavy weaponry against civilians. And this has turned out to be crucial because they've played a decisive role in the past day or so, eventually tired of these constant attacks not only on themselves but also on civilians. They responded with helicopter attacks on Gbagbo forces and taking out his heavy weaponry. This seems to have turned the tide.
It's fascinating. We on Small Screen Sessions are now taking questions through our Facebook page, and we've got one from a blogger known as Texas in Africa. How is it within the UN mandate to take sides?
Well, it's not, of course. The UN is not supposed to take sides, and it argues very adamantly that it hasn't taken sides in this conflict. All that it says it was doing was responding to these attacks by Gbagbo loyalists on civilians, and most notably the use of heavy weapons. But it's controversial what they've done, and the Russians, for example, are among those who are asking for clarification on what's been going on.
People have also been asking the question, why is the US getting involved militarily in Libya, but not in Cote d'Ivoire?
It's a good question. Both serious humanitarian crises, civilians caught up. Essentially, the military options were very, very limited in Cote d'Ivoire. Essentially, would have involved taking out Gbagbo himself, and that would have been a very, very complicated and tricky operation to do. I suppose also in Libya, you had this immediate and present threat against civilians in Benghazi, where Gaddafi was Forces were nearing the city, he was threatening people, and the international community stood up and took notice. In Cote d'Ivoire, it's been more of a slow-burning crisis until recent days, and we really haven't got a complete picture of what's been happening to civilians there, and so that's why you've seen a reluctance to get involved militarily and rely on the UN peacekeepers, which are already on the ground there.
Why does this matter to the United States?
Well, I think the main reason it matters is that President Obama, in his Africa policy, not long after becoming president, took a trip to Ghana, made a big speech. Number one priority for the US is to promote good governance and democracy. So when you have a guy like Gbagbo who loses an election and decides just to stay on in office anyway, this flies in the face of US policy. Now, 2011 is a crucial year in Africa. You have 27 elections taking place across the continent. So the precedent, the example that Gbagbo is setting is just a horrible one for the continent. You have some key US allies going to the polls, notably Nigeria, Africa's biggest democracy, this month. So, the idea that someone can blazonly ignore the views of the voting public, it just cannot be accepted by the United States.
It appears that Gbagbo could be now finally on his way out. What's next? What should we expect?
Well, it seems Gbagbo is negotiating the terms of his surrender. Really, he doesn't have much of a negotiating position. I think the very best he can hope for is a trip to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. As for Ouattara, president-elect, he's going to face a really difficult time uniting a country that's been divided for so long. He's going to have to show a lot of restraint and really act as a statesman in the coming weeks and months.
Richard Downie, thank you for your time.
You're welcome.